think actually everyone here would benefit a lot if you came to the CTO coronary session and hear the coronary CTO techniques, because many of them can actually help with what you do. Is I think I learned a lot about the devices and potential things that could apply to the coronary world. But in the next few minutes, I'll go over it, what was done in the coronary CTO program, and how this can potentially be applied into the, in the periphery. And the same goal applies for coronary and for periphery. The goal is to open the occlusion, open the vessel, and restore the flow. Same for coronary and for peripheral. And you saw this already. This is the algorithm that was put together in the coronary world that was now 5 years, published 5 years ago, and is slowly actually being adopted by many countries and now have much more data that we didn't have when we started with. But the way this started, that was a consensus document. This was not a very high-end scientific endeavor. It was a few people sitting in Bill Lombardi's lab in Seattle, in Washington State, and doing 17 cases in 3 days, drawing on a board strategies, and then the end putting it all together and creating this. And the components of this are that, first of all, everything we do is based on anatomy, which makes sense for coronary and periphery. On the coronary world, we have 4 parameters, and there's, I think, apply for the periphery, and keeping it simple is the key. Where does the lesion start, which is the proximal cap? Is it clear or unclear? Number 2, how long is the lesion? Is it long or short? Number 3, how is the distal vessel? Do you have a good distal vessel, or is the distal vessel in poor quality? And number 4, do you have interventional collaterals? Now, in the periphery, this can probably be, do you have pedal axis? It's a little slightly different, but these are the basic techniques. And the one thing actually I haven't seen in Subhas's algorithm I think might help is the last part, which is switch strategy. So in the coronary, you use these parameters to choose your initial approach. But I think what has made it very strong is that we don't do the same thing over and over again if it doesn't work. We don't spend 2 hours in guide wires because then your radiation goes up, your complications go up. But if things don't work within the first few minutes, and that time is dependable on your experience and the patient's anatomy, then you switch. So the switch, the change, has been a critical component of the hybrid algorithm. All techniques are part of this. This might be more difficult for periphery because there are many more devices and potential techniques, but this algorithm embraces every technique because there are some specific patients in whom some things works and some things don't. Once again, there are these 4 questions. So what we do when we plan a coronary CTO, we're sitting in the room with a fellow technician, sometimes if there's an industry rep, and write on the paper those 4 questions. Do we understand the proximal cap? Do we understand the lesion length, the distal vessel, where are the collaterals? And by doing this, and spending the time, and when I say 15 to 30 minutes, I'm not exaggerating. This is actually the time it takes, and I think periphery was probably very similar. The longer you spend looking at the lesion, then the better you can decide what needs to be done. And then what happens is you have a plan that I'm going to start antegrade with wires, go with a crossing device, or go retrograde if needed. Change is the critical part, as I mentioned, and that's, even for coronary operators, remains a challenge, especially early on in your learning curve. When you start, you are not sure, is it not working because I'm not good enough, or is it because of the anatomy? And the more experience you get, you can tell fairly quickly that this doesn't work in this scenario, let's move to something else. How often do you change? And that's something that depends on the complexity of the lesion, but that's from our early experience, and there was a change needed in about half of the cases, 32, 44%. And you can see the majority of cases can be done with the first strategy, but in many cases, several strategies were changed until you finally got the success. And when you look at the final, and that was again many years ago, but this applies today, about half were done with wires, a quarter with antegrade dissection reentry, which would be the crossing device in the periphery case, and about a quarter done with retrograde. And this is just a complex line showing, but whatever you start by going different pathways, at the end, you end up getting the high success rate. What is known in the coronary is that the techniques you're going to use depend on how complex is your lesion. So the more complex it is, and the way we do this in the coronary is by having a JCTO score. I'm not aware of many peripheral scores. That might be something to consider, having a score that describes the geographic complexity of the disease. But the more complexity is, what we're finding in the coronary world is, the more likely you are to need non-wire-based techniques, and that's dissection reentry or retrograde. The simpler the lesion, then wires work almost all the time. The more complex it gets, then you need to use the other strategies. This is some of the latest outcomes in more than 2,000 lesions, and when you see techniques that are being used, it's all techniques are being used. So in the coronary, at least, you cannot say, I'm not going to do dissection reentry, or I want to retrograde, because you're going to decrease your success rate. So use all techniques, and at the very end, back 5 years from the time we started up to now, 88% success rate, which for coronary is pretty good, 2.6% complication rate, and then half our wires, a quarter each are ADR and retrograde. The same results came from UK. That's from the UK hybrid registry. Very similar, 90% success, and the same strategies. And this is from multi-center European registry, published last year, showing very similar outcomes, 86% success. And once again, wires is the majority, but then you do need the other two, dissection-oriented and retrograde, to be succeed. The question also that has been pondered in the coronary world is, does this translate to clinical outcomes? And that's something I think very relevant for the periphery. In the coronary world, there's now many more data that you improve quality of life, you improve dyspnea, improve depression. And of course, in the periphery, these are different endpoints, loss of limb, ability to ambulate longer. The one thing we found in the coronary world, and it's became much more clear in the last couple of years, is that retrograde techniques are more dangerous. Retrograde is very powerful, there's no question, increased success rate, but if you look at complications, the complications are fourfold higher than if you stay antegrade. You have more myocardial infarction, you have more pericardiocentesis, you have a trend for higher mortality. So at least in the coronary world, you do get a penalty if you go retrograde. So if you can stay antegrade as much as you can, that's the way to go. Now, the penalty is probably much less or maybe non-existent in the periphery, because if you perforate, you're not going to have tamponade or other major events. Still not the event you have to have, but probably the consequences of perforation are not as bad in the periphery as well. The other thing we've seen in the coronary world, 5 years ago, major meetings, huge fights, people red-faced, about to beat each other about which technique works better. A lot of controversy, the section-oriented doesn't work. I mean, really, really animated. It turns out now everything is converging. Europe is converging. Japan, which has a very strong tradition for guide wire-based, are still now coming along and doing more dissection-oriented in addition to retrograde as well. So everything is converging. And now what we're seeing is we're keeping the main algorithm simple. There's the hybrid algorithm. But because there's complexity, there's things like ambiguous proximal caps, there are things like balloon uncrossable and dilatable, and you can expand it, but if you make it very complex and put everything in one, people can get lost. So what you can do is keep the basic hybrid algorithm as the basis of operations, and then for specific subsets, ambiguous cap, uncrossable, and dilatable, you have sub-algorithms to take care of that. And this is even in Japan now. This is the Asian Pacific CTO algorithm that is converging, is using the same geographic criteria. And although they do favor wires more than we do in the US and in Europe, the basic principles seem to be becoming the same. This is the algorithm for balloon uncrossable. So these are not embedded in the main algorithm, but you can apply them when things come over there. And the devices actually that we use in the coronary are to some extent similar to the periphery, the multi-cross and the cross you mentioned before. We have new things like the electrocautery assisted, where you actually burn through very tight ostia lesions. Ideally, you don't burn through the lesion, and then through the patient's pulmonary artery. And then you have now more studies trying to fine-tune this. We just finished enrollment in the cross-post first, which is combining an upfront wire escalation technique versus an upfront cross-post technique, and hopefully we'll have the results at TCT. But at the end of the day, the key thing also for periphery and coronary is before you do any of this, you want to make sure the risk and benefit is there. And we're now having score calculators to calculate procedural success for the coronary CTOs and procedural risk. And then you can tell the patient, your chance of success is 90%, your risk is 2 or 3%, and then based on this, do you want to have this done? And then if yes, then we'll proceed doing the case. So hybrid approach has been for the coronary world a kind of a bridge, bridging the people's approaches and getting the success up and the complications down, and I think it can be the same for the periphery as well. The key is to keep it, I think, simple. Keep it inclusive of all strategies, base it on angiogram. I would say change is very important. And of course, cost effectiveness is a factor, I think, maybe much more important in periphery given the reimbursements limitations you outline. And then having it that would facilitate everyone communication as well as research and outcomes. So thank you once again for having me here.